So good morning, everybody. It's welcome to this first keynote lecture. It's my particular pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dilip, an old friend. It's not hard to introduce Dilip. He is a giant in the area of game theory with many foundational contributions to several areas in game theory, to the theory of repeated games, to bargaining, to equilibrium selection, implementation, and so on. Dilip is a professor at New York University, and before that he's held positions at Harvard, Yale, and actually spent most of his career at Princeton. Dilip is a native of Bombay. He grew up in Bombay, and to embarrass him, I'll mention the fact that he went to high school, the same high school as Freddie Mercury of Queen, and Zubin Mehta. That he graduated from Elphinstone College, University of Bombay, and he came to he did his master's degree at the Delhi School of Economics. He went on to do an MPhil at Oxford and a PhD from Princeton. A little known fact about Dilip is that he actually spent a year at JNU studying history as well as a master's student, and that was, I think, because he missed his deadline for the application to the Delhi School of Economics. But I met some people a few years ago who were his classmates in history at JNU, and they were all lamenting the fact that he'd left history to become an economist. So anyway, I won't take up more of your time. I could regale you with stories of Dilip all evening, all day actually. So instead, Dilip.
Aruna, thank you for an incredibly generous introduction. And most of all, thanks for not regaling the audience with more stories. So that was a huge relief. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be here, a special pleasure to be here, and a special pleasure to be introduced by Arunav, who is an old friend and a very valued co-author. So let me go on and with the presentation. So this is on bargaining with multiple buyers, and it's joint work with Mihai Mania, who's in Stony Brook. So this is a simple bargaining problem where a single seller is dealing with multiple buyers, or equivalently a buyer facing multiple sellers. If the seller is a monopolist, this is a setting we understand well. So this is a bargaining problem. So if you have complete information and perfect price discrimination, in the monopoly problem with perfect price discrimination, of course, the monopolist extracts all surplus from every buyer. And a question, so what we're interested in knowing is what happens in the same informational setting when the terms of trade are determined by bargaining between each buyer and the seller. Oh, I see. I do have this. Sorry, can you hear me at the back or in the front? Okay. Okay, thank you. So to go on, so it's a single seller dealing with multiple buyers. So if the seller has an available unit for every potential buyer, So this situation really boils down to pure bilateral bargaining. And we understand pure bilateral bargaining with a single seller, so that situation is straightforward. So the more interesting situation is when there's some limitation in the supply. So if there are Q units available and that you're bargaining with more than Q potential buyers. And the question is more interesting, intriguing, with an additional twist. The seller may actually place restrictions on the set of buyers she transacts with. This might be profitable for the seller. Okay, so I'll explain what I mean in more detail soon. So I'd just like to clarify that this is really not a Gaussian problem. So one might be led to think of a Gaussian monopolist. So this is not a Gaussian problem because the informational assumptions are different. A Gaussian monopolist actually doesn't know individual buyer valuations. We're going to assume that the seller knows individual buyer valuations. So a Gaussian monopolist would actually want to restrict supply. We know that a Gaussian monopolist would. And we also know, we understand how they would want to do it. So this is really to point out that if you're thinking of restricted supply in this problem, it's actually not connected with the motivations for a Gaussian monopolist to restrict supply. Okay, so just to clarify that if you're trying to draw analogies with the Gaussian situation, you'd be barking up the wrong tree. So it's mostly a clarification. So there are many examples of a seller contracting with multiple buyers, and here are a few of them. So I'll assume you will understand that it's kind of a well-motivated question. So moving on. And the value exclusion commitments have been recognized for some time now. And in application, both in theory and applications, in the health economics literature, there's this phenomenon of insurance companies restricting networks of hospitals you could transact with, and this is an issue people have wanted to understand. I will be talking a little bit, I'm not sure how much, about comparing our work with an earlier paper by Ho and Lee, who were the first to model exclusion commitments in a general model of bargaining in networks. So, and our model, so I'm going to be talking about a rather simplified network, but our basic model and our results are basically different, and I will, if there's time, contrast our results with theirs. Okay, so the setting is really simple. We have a seller who will be indexed as player 0, and that seller is trying to form bilateral contracts with n buyers who are indexed 1 through lowercase n. So the buyers, we are going to assume that they have unit demand and they have values for the good net of seller cost, which are indexed by AI. The one thing to remember is that valuations are decreasing in the index. Okay, so and there are no externalities. So a buyer's values are independent of who else gets unit of the good. So the externalities case is interesting. It's not the case that we look at in this work. So I will sometimes talk as if there are identical units that are being offered, but there's no presumption that's the case. So it's really that the transactions can be completely idiosyncratic that the seller can make with each of the buyers. And when we talk about sales restrictions, we'll often use the language of units as if they're homogeneous units. It's just restrictions on the sets of buyers, the seller is permitted to transact with. Okay, so again, we have values that are denoted A sub I, bargaining with a common discount factor delta. So the bargaining protocol, which I will specify in more detail soon, is basically that in each round, the seller, it's the seller dealing with multiple buyers, gets to choose a buyer to transact with in each round. But the proposer in that round is chosen randomly. Okay, so a seller approaches a buyer, and then a coin is flipped to decide who makes a proposal. A proposal is made. If the proposal is accepted, then that transaction is complete. If not, you move on to the next round. Okay. And the focus will be on the limit case, where the time between offers is going to 0, or equivalently delta going to 1. So if there's no restriction in supply, then it's understood that in this setting, in a setting which is kind of symmetric in the probability of making a proposal, the payoffs of the seller are going to converge to essentially half the valuations of each of the buyers. Okay, so symmetric alternating offer bargaining converges to an equal split, and that's been well understood for a long time now. So it converges to the symmetric Nash bargaining solution. Okay. When there are restrictions in supply, so suppose there are 2 buyers and only 1 unit of the good, then in the bargaining setting, the seller essentially trades with the highest valuation buyer, but at a price which is a max of the equal split and the valuation of the low valuation buyer. Okay, so it's like a second price auction, so to speak, except if the outside option is not binding when you get back to the equal split. Okay, so this is an old result. So it's not that the payoff is an equal split of the difference between the outside option and the value. So that is the content of this result. And in work by Mihai in 2018, the outside option is endogenous, as it will be in this work. And when the outside option is binding, it is exercised, but with limit probability that goes to 0 in the patient limit. Okay. So here I just want to explore the possibility of the benefits of restricting supply. Okay, so suppose a seller actually has the ability to supply all the demand in the market, to bargain with all potential buyers in the market. Might they benefit from placing restrictions on who they interact with? Okay, so let's say that there are 3 buyers. Then if the seller were to commit, in some way, so which we will be more specific about soon, to trade primarily with buyers 1 and 2. So remember that if there were 2 potential buyers, then what really happens is that you trade primarily when the outside option is binding. Okay, so suppose, say, A1 is equal to 4 and A2 is equal to 3. Then the equal split would be 2. This is a situation where the outside option is binding, and what happens in that case when n equals 2 and q equals 1 is that the seller bargains, trades with probability close to 1 as delta goes to 1 with the high valuation buyer, but not at an equal split price, but at a price of 3. Okay, so extending that idea to the case of 3 buyers with 2 units available, and if you keep buyer 3 as an outside option, with that supply restriction, the profit is going to be the max of the equal split and the outside option for each of the first two buyers. Okay, so that's the first term. And of course, the probability, the profit without the supply restriction is an equal split with each of the buyers. And it's easy to see that the supply restriction might be beneficial. And you know, one of those bullet points has a sufficient condition for the restriction to be, so there's no surprise there. But so there is a first order reason to be thinking about supply restrictions in a serious way, okay? But they might be beneficial to the seller. Okay. So you might, so imagine, so this is a world in which we're going to assume that the seller can commit to a rich set of supply restrictions. Let's consider a very simple set of supply restrictions, which are, you know, to just say that, look, I will serve at most Q buyers. Okay, so if they serve exactly Q buyers, then their payoff is the sum, the first sum that you see. Okay, I guess I should be using this pointer and not. Okay, and you know, if the seller had the ability to commit to different Qs, well, they would try to choose a Q to maximize that quantity. Okay, and indeed, in Ho and Lee, the prediction of their model is exactly this quantity here. Okay, and that's obtained by some. So that's the prediction of the model, and that is obtained with some kind of bargaining protocol, which I will briefly talk about. Okay. Oh no, yes. So this is an entire slide devoted to the protocol. So in this protocol, the seller, let's say in our situation where the network is very simple, the seller announces a network that they will deal with, and the seller dispatches independent agents to bargain with each of the buyers in the network, and those agents operate independently of one another, and they can only transact with a designated buyer or an outside option. Okay. So there's no, you know, it's a very disaggregated way of bargaining where these agents do not have anything to do with one another. And interestingly, in the same year, there's another paper with Lee as one of the co-authors where they critique this protocol. Essentially for its somewhat schizophrenic nature, where agents cannot actually integrate the interests of the seller by somehow coordinating with one another. Okay, and in a sense, it's really backward engineered to derive the formula earlier. Okay. So our bargaining protocol is the following. It's the seller chooses a buyer to bargain with in every round. After the buyer is chosen, the seller and buyer are selected to make an offer with equal probability. So I kind of indicated that this was the protocol earlier. So it's a very standard protocol. It's not original to us. I say our to distinguish it from the whole Lee protocol. And this device of a random choice of proposer is an old device, which is a way of getting away from the seller having all the bargaining power, right? It's not the seller making a take it or leave it offer to each of the buyers. The buyers have bargaining power. That is because they are randomly chosen to make proposals. Okay, so and we'll be looking at the case where they have equal bargaining power conditional on being chosen. So each of them could make a proposal with equal probability. Okay, so the seller is not in a symmetric position with the buyers ex ante because they can choose which buyer to approach, but upon approaching a buyer, they are in a symmetric position. Okay, so each. Okay, and The solution concept is Markov perfect equilibrium. So we're going to focus, where the state is simply the set of remaining potential buyers. Okay, so you will have potentially transacted with some set of buyers already, and the state of the system is the set of buyers remaining. Okay, that's the state at the beginning of a round. Of course, at the beginning of a round, the seller gets to choose a potential buyer, and so then the state is the potential buyer chosen and the buyers remaining. Okay. So, various questions arise naturally. So you might ask, so we explored those, and this is really actually how we started thinking about this. We kind of looked at a variety of simple examples, including this one. And you might ask, look, are MP outcomes unique in this model? Okay, so we're used to finding uniqueness in a variety of bargaining models. When you restrict attention to Markov perfect equilibrium, of course, in the bilateral bargaining case, Rubinstein famously showed that all subgame perfect equilibrium outcomes are unique. That's not true once you get past the bilateral case, but there's a huge range of cases where MP outcomes are unique, at least in the patient limit. Okay, not true here. Are buyers constant? Are buyer payoffs constants across MPs? No. Is the set of buyers who trade the same across MPs? No. Okay, so that's significant. So if you looked at the n equals 2 case with q equals 1, it is the case that both buyers trade with positive probability, but in the limit, it's only one buyer who's trading with limit probability 1. Okay, so so there's no, you could easily conjecture that the set of buyers who trade is the same across MPs. That's not the case. And indeed, you get, and that is not true even within fixing. So this is not simply variation across MPs. Even within an MP, there's a probability distribution over the set of buyers who trade. Okay. Are seller payoffs constant across MPs? That looking at the examples, that remains an open possibility. Indeed, we will find that seller payoffs are actually pinned down in this framework. Okay, so notation S, the state, is the set of remaining buyers, which I mentioned. UIS is the expected payoff of player I given state S. 0 is the index of the seller, and by lowercase by S is the probability that seller I approaches buyer I in state S in a given MP. Okay, so an MP, at least at the start of a round, is going to have fixed probabilities of approaching any particular buyer I given the state S. Okay, and the UIs without an argument refer to the equilibrium utilities at the start of play before you traded with any possible buyer. Okay. Okay, this is there's a lot of stuff here. So this is detailing what happens in the same example. So we have in this example there are 3 MPs as for sufficiently high delta. There's an MP in which in the first round the seller doesn't approach the highest valuation buyer but approaches the other 2. Okay. And in this MPE is actually efficient. So the uppercase pi's refer, so there are two rounds of play in equilibrium. You approach someone in the first round, and actually trade is going to happen in the first round. And then there are three buyers, 2 units, that the possibility of transacting with two buyers, transact with one buyer in the first round, subsequent buyer in the second. So in the first two MPEs, you have efficient trade in the sense that the probability of trade with buyers 1 and 2, who are the higher valuation buyers. Okay, remember that the valuations decline with the index, are 1. So this is the probability of trade across the 2 rounds. That's the uppercase pi. And the bar refers to the limit as delta goes to 1. The lowercase pi's are what happens in the first round. But the third MPE is actually not efficient in the sense that there is a positive probability of trade with the lowest valuation buyer, even in the patient limit. Okay, so the probability of trade in the limit with the low valuation buyer is 1/4, and there's quite a variation in the payoffs of the buyers. There's no variation in the payoff of the seller, it turns out, and in all 3 cases it's equal to 4. Okay, and yes, okay, which is different from what you'd get by just thinking of the third buyer as an outside option for the first 2 buyers. That outside option would not be binding in this case, okay, because the payoff 1 is less than half the value of both these buyers. So the outside option, in a conventional way of thinking, is kind of irrelevant in this example. Okay. Okay. So the point of this slide is to suggest that a rich set of exclusion restrictions might actually be potentially useful. Okay, so think of a setup where there are multiple copies of different buyer types. So there are 3 buyer types here. There's a type that has valuation 100, a type who has valuation 10, and a type that has valuation 1. And let's say there are 4 copies of each of these types. Okay. If you don't have any restrictions, supply restrictions, then the seller's payoff is just going to be the average of the valuations, okay, which in this case is going to be 2 multiplied by 111. Okay. But one might conjecture that the seller would do better by saying, look, I'll sell to all but 1 of each type. Okay, so type 1, I will sell to at most 3 copies of type 1. I will sell to at most 3 copies of type 2, and so on. Okay, and borrowing the intuition from the outside option principle that I talked about earlier, when you're dealing with, let's say, type 1 where valuation 100, you will be able to extract all surplus from each of those buyers, because the relevant outside option for that type is actually one of them who has a valuation of 100. Okay, so you would actually, by committing to an exclusion restriction of that sort, be able, one would conjecture, to get a payoff equal to that. Okay, which of course is in excess of what you would get without any exclusion restrictions. Okay, so the point of this slide, if the details are a little bit obscure, is that there is a prima facie case for thinking about complex exclusion restrictions, a rich set of exclusion restrictions. Okay. So, you could think of a variety of exclusion restrictions. I will trade with only 5 buyers. I will trade with only odd numbers buyers, and so on. Okay, if I trade with I will not trade with J or K, etc. A Q supply commitment, that's something that we'll be talking more about, is a very simple supply commitment. It just says I will trade with at most Q buyers without any restriction on who those Q buyers are. Okay, so that would be a relatively uncomplicated exclusion restriction. Okay, so some of the other ones are a little bit more, a little bit richer, more complex. Okay. So here is a formalization of the exclusion restriction. It's very simple. For any set of buyers remaining, the exclusion restriction tells you which buyers are excluded from trade in that round. Okay, so it's just a mapping from subsets that are meant to be interpreted as the set of buyers remaining to and E of S tells you who you're not allowed to trade with. Okay, and that should be clear. This restriction means that the exclusion restriction is non-trivial. So it becomes messy to allow for exclusion restrictions which are actually not exclusion restrictions. So we're assuming non-trivial exclusion restrictions. That is to say, if there's only one agent remaining, that agent has to be excluded. Okay, that's what the second bullet point says. And we're also assuming actually that exclusion is irreversible. If at some stage in the process you exclude buyer J, then that buyer will be excluded at all future stages of the process. Okay, so if you exclude someone now, they're excluded forever. So this formalization is very permissive, and it permits all the examples we had on the earlier slide. So it's very rich, and you might wonder why. So it's just that it makes the conclusion stronger, such as they are, to allow for all possible. So you are not vulnerable to the critique. What if you allowed for even a richer set of restrictions? What would happen, and so on. Okay, so it's a good thing to allow for very baroque possibilities. Okay. Okay, so this is the question. This is one of the questions we address. What is an optimal exclusion commitment? Okay, now, notation. U naught is the seller. U naught is the seller's payoff in some MP sigma, given some discount factor delta. Okay, is that clear? So the seller's payoff in some equilibrium, and with some exclusion restriction in the background. So I could have added a script E over here. So there is an exclusion restriction, and this is the set of all MPs given that exclusion restriction, given that discount factor. And because these sets, because there are multiple MPs, okay, with different possible payoffs, I can't ask, what is an optimal exclusion restriction, right? So I have, it depends on which equilibria I select. So I could be pessimistic, in which case I get a high number. So I'm looking for an optimal restriction. So I'm always maximizing with respect to the choice of restrictions, okay? And I'm interested in what happens as delta goes to 1. So I'm optimistic both in the equilibrium I select and also in what limit I take given these equilibria. So I look at an appealing limit of the soup, or I can be pessimistic and look at the lowest, the lim inf of the worst payoff. Okay, so there are two M's here. So there are two natural polar notions of the payoff that results from an exclusion restriction. There's an optimistic notion, there's a pessimistic notion There's an optimistic limit, there's a pessimistic limit, okay? And it could be that there are different answers to these questions, so we'd be interested in these two bounds, okay? So is that, okay? So I'm now diving into some analysis. Despite what Arunav said, if there's something I can clarify, I'd be happy to take a question. Okay. So in any MP, trade takes place in every round. Okay, that is a familiar result, in a range of bargaining models. So there's no unnecessarily delay. Okay, that's one base. So I'm actually going through some simple analysis now to kind of get to optimality of exclusion commitments. Okay. Okay. So in a bilateral bargaining setting in this world, there's going to be an equal split of payoffs between the buyer and the seller. Okay. Now, the seller has an advantageous position relative to the buyers because the seller can choose buyers. After the choice, there's more symmetry because the proposed. Okay. But this is simply saying that an equal split is an upper bound on what a buyer can get in the limit as delta goes to 1. Okay, so this is the result you would expect, and it is indeed true that a buyer's payoff in the limit has to be less than the equal split. It's an intuitive result. It turns out to be a little bit complicated to pin down because there are multiple buyers. The choice of buyers is strategic and possibly stochastic, but the result is true. Okay. This is another intuitive result that okay. So you have n buyers, you have q less than n buyers that you are permitted to trade with in a simple Q supply commitment. Okay, so the seller says, look, I will trade with at most Q buyers, very straightforward exclusion restriction. They're not particular about who they trade with until their commitment is exhausted. So there's no special restriction until that point. And this says that it's always the case that if your valuation is lower than the Q plus 1th valuation, weakly lower, then your payoff has to be equal to 0. Okay, so it's, so suppose Q is equal to 5 and N is equal to 10, and the first Q values are all equal, then the first Q buyers have a payoff of 0. This is what it's saying, but if there are strict inequalities, it's that buyers Q plus 1 through N will have a 0 payoff. Okay. So interestingly, so in I don't know if in the simple case where there are 2 buyers and 1 unit for sale, we know that the low valuation buyer has a 0 payoff, but it's also the case that the low valuation buyer trades with probability 0 in the limit. So this is not true here. So interesting and different things can happen with respect to probabilities of trade, even for buyers who are the outside options or worse than the outside options. Okay, so so if if there are 10 possible buyers and Q is equal to 5, it is actually possible that buyers 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 trade with positive probability in equilibrium. Okay. So at the heart of one, so there's the argument is a kind of scissors, and one blade of the scissors is this what we call a sequential outside option principle. Okay, so it's like the outside option principle, but it recognizes the dynamics of the bargaining process. Okay. So what does it say? That so at the start of play, so we're looking at, let's look at the special case of an n-1 supply commitment, which will actually turn out to be important for us. So there are n buyers, you committed to excluding one buyer, but it doesn't matter who that buyer is, that's what you've committed to. So we know that the lowest valuation buyer by the previous lemma has a utility of 0 in any in the limit in any NPE. Okay, so that buyer knows that they have a utility of 0. So you can actually approach that buyer and offer that buyer nothing, and that buyer will happily accept. And if the buyer gets to be the proposer, they will essentially offer you all their surplus because they know they actually have a 0 equilibrium payoff. Okay, so the only equilibrium outcome, if you approach the lowest value buyer, entails being able to extract full surplus from the lowest valuation buyer. Okay, that's a simple immediate consequence that they are the lowest valuation buyer, and there's a restriction on how many buyers you're going to trade with. Okay, so the buyer at the bottom of the heap, when one buyer is to be excluded, has a 0 expected payoff, and you can extract full surplus from that buyer. Okay, so an available strategy for the seller is to go to the lowest valuation buyer, extract full surplus from the lowest valuation buyer. Okay. But once they have done that, the lowest valuation buyer is now the second lowest valuation buyer from the point of view of the start of play. Okay, so the outside option is actually sequentially improving. So they can actually do the same thing with the second lowest valuation, okay, and so on. So if they exercise this outside option sequentially, they're able to obtain a payoff. So this is something that is possible in any NPE. It doesn't mean that that's what they're going to do in the NPE, but this is an available strategy. So it places a lower bound on their possible payoffs. Okay, and that lower bound is actually pretty good. It's that you can extract full surplus from the n-1 lowest value buyers. Okay, and that sounds pretty good, except that the highest valuation buyers in this case might actually have a very high valuation. Okay, and that's so, but the seller can actually do better in general. Okay. So again, look at the case we're looking at the case here in establishing the lower bound on the n-1 supply commitment, a very particular simple supply commitment where you commit to excluding one buyer. Okay. So using the logic that the lowest valuation buyer amongst the remaining set of buyers has a utility and equilibrium of 0, whichever NPE you're looking at, okay, without being specific about the NPE, what the seller can do is to go to the lowest valuation and so on sequentially all the way to the nth plus 1 buyer, okay, in the sequence. So goes to buy n-1 all the way to L plus 1, skips buyer L, okay, and trades with buyers the L-1 highest valuations. Okay, so in any equilibrium, they have to give up on one possible buyer because they have an n-1 supply commitment. Okay, but one available strategy for them is to peel off the lowest valuations all the way to the Lth lowest valuations, give up on L, okay, and trade with the remainder. Right? Okay. So we know that that strategy gives them this payoff from the lowest valuations. They get a 0 payoff from buyer L because they've skipped buyer L. And we're agnostic in a limited way about what payoff they get from the top L-1 valuations, but we know that they have to extract at least half the surplus from each of those buyers. Okay, half the surplus is a lower bound on what they can extract from any buyer, right? We can say something tighter in this case because of the sequential outside option principle, and here we're being agnostic. Okay. So if they choose L, this is a lower bound on their payoff in any MPE, and they can choose L optimally, and that creates a lower bound for the seller who has an N-1 supply commitment across all MPEs. Okay? So a lower bound on this payoff U naught is this number on the right hand side, which we'll call M star. Okay? So it's the max of this formula, this simple formula where you divide a few terms by 2, you don't divide the remaining terms, and you skip out the L term. That's what we call M star. And what this says is that M lower bar has to be greater than or equal to M star. Okay? M lower bar is a lower bound across all possible exclusion commitments. I've given you a particular exclusion commitment which attains the payoff M star. So M bar is a lower bound if we are free to choose a commitment in an optimal way. Okay, so this is a payoff attainable by a particular commitment. Okay. There is a converse to the result that a buyer has to pay at least fair prices. Okay, so the converse to that result is that if a buyer in an MPE is assured of trade with probability 1, so a buyer need not fear exclusion by the seller in a given MPE for any stochastic sequences of moves and choices by the seller, then actually that buyer is in a pretty good position. A lower bound on their possible payoffs is an equal split. Okay, and we also know it's an upper bound. So it means that a buyer who is confident of being served has a payoff in the limit that's equal to half their valuation. Okay. So by this condition, the with probability 1 is not with limit probability 1. It actually means with probability 1. Okay, so it's short trade. So notice that in the simple case of the outside option with 2 buyers. So let's look at this example: A1 equals 5 and A2 equals 4. Then as delta, and if there's only 1 unit of supply available, as delta goes to 1, the higher valuation trades with limit probability 1, but they trade at a price of 4, okay, which is far from an equal split. Okay, so the limit probability 1 is quite different from with probability 1. Okay, so in this case, with 2 buyers and only 1 unit, there is no buyer who trades with probability 1 in any MPE. Okay, is that clear? So this is the fair pricing really applies to short trade. Okay. So that actually means that an upper bound on seller profits associated with any exclusion commitment is this number M star, which we defined as the max of this formula across all possible L's. Okay. So why is that? Remember that an exclusion commitment is a real exclusion commitment. Someone has to be excluded. So if you look at an MPE, there will be someone has all buyers in any MPE. It is impossible that all buyers trade with probability 1 in any MPE. So there's going to be a lowest index of a buyer who trades with probability 1. And all buyers with indices above that lowest index trade with probability less than 1 in any MPE. Okay? So there's going to be a lowest index of a buyer who trades with probability 1. And a seller has to be indifferent between all sequences of buyers that they approach and trade. Every time they approach a buyer, they trade with a buyer. Okay? So there is an optimal strategy for a seller which involves trading with probability 1 with all buyers with lower index than L. So L is the lowest index of a buyer who trades with probability less than 1. So all buyers with indices lower than L actually trade with probability 1. So an optimal strategy for the seller is to actually trade with buyers 1 through L minus 1 with probability 1 and exclude buyer L, because there are that in equilibrium the seller does not trade with L with probability 1. Okay? So there are strategies that the seller uses which entail excluding buyer L, and those strategies have to be optimal, right? So the seller has to be indifferent across all pure strategies in their support when they're using a mixed strategy, and in particular the pure strategy that involves excluding buyer L is a pure strategy in the support of the seller's optimal mixed strategy. Okay? So what is the seller's expected payoff from this sequence of excluding buyer L? Well, for buyers L plus 1 through N, the most that they can do is to get full surplus, right? They've excluded buyer L. The most they can do with the others is to get full surplus. And the buyers with indices lower than L, well, those are buyers that you trade with probability 1 by the definition of the index L, right? That's the first bullet point. L is the smallest index of a buyer who trades with probability less than 1. So anyone with a smaller index trades with probability 1. So we know that the maximum surplus extractable from those buyers with a lower index is half their surplus. Okay? So for an MPE which involves some L, and there has to be some such L because someone has to be excluded. Oh, is that right? Okay. So an upper bound on seller payoffs is the max across all these L's. Okay, I've just been told I have very few minutes left. Okay, so this is an upper bound. Okay, what this means is that we actually know the answer to our questions. What is the optimal commitment to these two problems? Well, it's the same one. It's the n-1 supply commitment. The n-1 supply commitment is optimal for the pessimistic problem because it attains a payoff m star from a pessimistic perspective, which we also know is the maximal attainable payoff from an optimistic perspective. Okay, so you're squeezed between the lower bound and the upper. So if you look at the n-1 supply commitment, the lower bound of payoffs from the n-1 supply commitment is m star, which we argued earlier. We also know that an upper bound across all possible exclusional commitments is m star, and you're squeezed between these uppers and lower bounds. These coarse, we have a coarse upper bound and a coarse lower bound, and they coincide, and therefore they are tight. Okay, so we actually have a convergence of these upper and lower bounds, and so what we know is that the n-1 supply commitment actually solves these problems. And if we look at any sequence of MPEs of the game with an n-1 supply commitment, the seller's expected payoff converges to m star. Okay, so the seller's dynamic payoff converges to this optimal payoff in the static problem, which was to there was this formula, the simple formula where you chose the max with respect to L, and that is actually the payoff that emerges from the dynamic problem. Okay, So it is possible that exclusion is not remember we defined exclusion to actually be a non-trivial exclusion. You have to exclude someone. It is possible, logically possible, that it actually is better to serve the entire market. Okay, so that is a logical possibility. It's not a typical situation because it would require extreme differences between buyer valuations, okay, for no exclusion to be optimal. So arguably, typically exclusion is optimal, but just for completeness, I'm mentioning that it's possible. So all this stuff was about payoffs. It's not about behavior in terms of who the seller goes to. Okay, so you might conjecture that in the n-1 supply commitment, in analogy with the case of 2 buyers and 1 unit for sale, that the seller sells to the top n-1 valuations with limit probability 1, with probability 1 in the limit. Okay, that would be a natural conjecture. That actually is not true, as we've seen in the example. Okay, but what is true is that, of course, it's true that the L star from the static problem, which has this notion that you're excluding buyer L star, including buyers with indices lower than L star with probability 1, and dealing with buyers lower than L star with probability 1 also. That's how we kind of derive the bound. Okay, so you might think that that is somehow reflected in the equilibrium. That is only partially reflected in the equilibrium. So it turns out, of course, that as you might expect, that buyers with lower indices than L star are actually traded with probability 1, you know, for high enough delta. But buyer L star is actually also traded with limit probability 1, not with probability 1, but in the limit with probability 1, which is interesting because you know, the strategy that we used to get the lower bound involved excluding buyer L star. But in any equilibrium, actually, buyer L star is included. In fact, it is included in the limit with probability 1. Okay, so the exclusions involve buyers with indices lower than L star, as it turns out. Okay, I see. Okay, so finally I should say that, okay, so this was a kind of the rich problem of exclusion restriction, a simpler problem, and actually in the current version of the paper, this is the problem we start with. I find it a somewhat less interesting, but the simple problem, the plain vanilla problem is, you know, you have Q units for sale, n potential buyers. What happens? You know, what are the seller's limit payoffs? Now, it turns out that there's really a really tight connection between the optimal exclusion restriction and this problem here. So this, if you will, is a classic bargaining problem. You have 10 buyers, you have 7 units, there's 7 buyers you can trade with. What happens? Okay, it turns out that this is what happens. It's determined by the same formula. Okay, so what happens if, okay, so suppose that you have, let's say you have 10 buyers and Q equals 4, then you just use this formula with respect to Q equals 4. Okay, and you look at the top 5 valuations and you choose your L optimally. That is actually going to be the outcome. That is the answer to the plain vanilla problem, and you know, the structure of that problem is actually turns out to be exactly the same as the structure of the optimal exclusion commitment problem, because it turns out the optimal exclusion commit and optimal exclusion commitment is a simple supply restriction. Okay, and it's a supply restriction of just 1 unit. Okay. Okay, so this is a slide which says that our answer is actually very different from Ho and Lee, and really the heart of the difference is that the outside option principle which is driving our results is a sequential outside option principle, not a kind of static outside option principle, where there's a fixed outside option for each one of the buyers that you deal with. Okay, and it turns out in the holy work, if you have 10 buyers and 7 units available for sale, you might actually benefit by restricting supply to less than 7. Okay, it's easy to find examples where you do that. That's never the case in our work. Okay, so you would, if you only had 7 units for sale and you had the ability to add on top of that further restrictions, you never want to exercise that ability. Okay, because the Q, so long as Q is less than N, that is actually an optimal supply commitment. Okay, okay, that's it. The externalities case is interesting, and that deserves attention. And this was general in terms of one side of the market. You'd certainly be interested in a case where you had multiple sellers and multiple buyers, in more general network settings. Okay, I am done. Oh, thank you. Arnav, it's on you now.
So how would you model?
Oh my gosh, no, that was a joke. Oh, you could kind of model it in the same way, Arnav. I'm not fresh on this.
I was asking him how you would model.
Arunav has asked a very deep question. How would you model externalities? Well, you could look at simple cases where somehow the structure of the argument was not altered. So if the relative ordering of the valuations of the buyers was not affected by who, then I think most of the arguments would go through. Okay, so you could imagine externalities being relevant but not upsetting those orderings in a dramatic way. So that would be one simple extension that we did in the back of the envelope kind of conjectures about. But that is a restrictive assumption. If the orderings of the valuations change, then one would have to think hard about
Orderings change depending on who gets it.
exactly. So that would be one important difference between the no external. Okay, so you might sell to a particular buyer, but that might change how the remaining valuations are ordered, and that would be important. Okay, but that would be an interesting problem, very interesting problem to look at. I think actually there might be a pretty formula for that case also. Yeah. Prajeev, did you have a question? Oh, go for it. Oh my God, this is terrifying.
Probably I didn't understand something. The M star depends only on the valuations.
Yes.
So then how could it be that the seller payoffs can differ across the MPEs? You initially said it's a maybe.
No, it is, so they don't. They're equal to M star
Right.
in the limit. They're equal to M star in the limit. So it was.
Initially when you said that, okay, buyer payoffs can differ, you can have multiple MPEs, and then you said, with regard to seller payoffs, it's not a yes or a no, it's a maybe, and that's...
It was a maybe from just looking at the example. Okay, so
Oh, I see.
it was.
But you're able to answer
Yes.
the question that
I was
it's-
just saying, what can be learned from the example?
Oh,
What cobwebs does that clarify? Okay, so it was. So that's how we kind of got into it. So there were things that were obviously not going to be true. So we didn't bother to try to prove them. And the buyer case was, the seller case, maybe that is true actually. Then it turned out to be true. Yeah. Yeah.
Pedestrian question. I'm a macroeconomist, so is there something here really about the sequence, or can I think of the whole lead case where the delegated agent is allowed to go to the buyer and lie about who's the outside option?
But what does lying mean?
Meaning, I guess I would have a very complicated order about the outside option is not the excluded agent, but it's
No,
not
but
the same excluded agent, but it's shift buyer by buyer.
But what is that protocol? What does it mean? You know, so we're in a situation, a complete information situation.
It has to include some incomplete information for some.
Okay, but you know, it seems like a tormented way to kind of think about it, right? So you know, what you should be doing, I think, is being honest about a protocol that seems natural and just seeing where it leads. You know, so I think this is what we did. I think. You know, Ho and Lee have done all sorts of wonderful things, but I think there was a formula that seemed natural and convenient and so on, and you know, reasonably intuitive, and then you know, one is obligated to have a non-cooperative implementation of that result, and this was the one they came up with, and it's, you know, it's clear that you. The complications in the model are exactly that the state changes, you know, and it changes in a complicated way. But, you know, by having everything happen simultaneously, it's really like a one-shot interaction, you know. So it's the simplest way to extract the structure of the pure bilateral problem in a multilateral setting. Okay, so that was really in a sense the intent of the protocol. Okay, so. You know, there might be a complicated way to do this, but that I think would defeat the purpose of the exercise, which is, you know, to have a natural protocol and, you know, see what happens. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
So there are two questions. One is a question that Murali asked, but he doesn't want to ask, so I'm going to ask it, at least the last question. And the other question sort of follows up on the question that you addressed earlier. And so I thought that there probably is so I must be missing something in the model. I thought there is a high-level argument here which should rule out the seller earning different profits in different half of perfect equilibrium, because one might think that the seller would pick the mark of perfect equilibrium.
Sorry, no, how are they supposed to pick it? You're not allowed to pick equilibria in general, right? This is not
But you're picking the first buyer.
But that doesn't mean that you get, no, that doesn't mean you get to pick equilibria.
No, sure, but I would have thought that would help you pin down. No, it
No.
doesn't. Okay.
No, I mean, it is pinned down by the analysis, but not by a high-level argument.
Okay.
Yeah, so no, certainly the ability to pick a buyer does not translate into the ability to pick an NPE.
Okay.
No, I mean it's that is, you know, in a sense obviously false, because, you know, if there were different payoffs that you could access by picking different buyers, then, you know, you would obviously access those, and so you could not have, you know, multiple NPE outcomes. You couldn't call them equilibrium outcomes.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So the second question is Murali's question. And so what would happen here?
Oh, Murali, hi. How are you? Okay.
So what would happen here if you ran an auction, and would that, you know,
If you ran an auction, okay. So the objective of this is to do bilateral bargaining. Okay, so that's the goal. If you ran an auction, certainly in the two-player case, you would get the same answer. I don't know what would happen if you ran. So you say ran a simultaneous second price auction.
I was thinking maybe in a
So you know, if you just did a straight auction, then I think you would actually get the whole Lee formula. You know, it would be the the excluded buyer who kind of drives the price, right? So if you had 5 units available, right, so the price would really have to be the 5th highest valuation, okay, between the 5th highest valuation and the 6th highest valuation, right? Something between those two, right? So you wouldn't get this equal split which comes from bilateral bargaining. By the way, I want to say that the bilateral bargaining case is actually quite natural for these applications. You know, you're an insurance company, you're interacting with different hospitals. It's a very idiosyncratic transaction, so it might actually be necessary to do it in a bilateral way. Okay, so it's not an unnatural way to conceptualize, I would say, a range of these interactions. Okay, you don't see, you see a lot of these things being negotiated. Okay, they're not actually being driven by some kind of auction. Yep. Oh.
Just to clarify, it seems that the bargaining is efficient in the sense that it's going to the most people with the highest valuations. Is that right?
No, that is not right. Actually, it's not. It is right in the 2 buyer case. Okay, but once you get past 2 buyers, that is not right. Actually, so you know, the opening example which I put up, and which actually guided our thinking about this. Trade is inefficient in some MPs. Yeah, the last one. Very good memory.
And with the externalities, if you wanted, would it be useful at all to thinking of trading in blocks then? And because you can think of the highest valuations as being configurations of.
No, that's true. So with externalities, you there might be really good reasons to, as you say, to trade with coalitions. Okay, so I think the problem becomes more complicated and potentially a lot more interesting. Precisely because you might want to commit in a trade to excluding certain buyers who might say lower the valuation of a particular coalition. Exactly. Yeah.
I wanted to ask something more policy related. The question is, the government is leasing out mines. Of course, your analysis shows as if doing bargaining or excluding some buyers possible, perhaps they give government much more revenue than the current system where bids are being invited. So I wanted to know your views on this, because currently this is the practice. And I think the underlying thinking is that in case, think of broadband, where relatively lower prices were charged because they could provide those benefits to the consumers. So what do you think of this?
No, I think if the purpose was to extract the highest revenue, then there would be ways to do it, which would be different from the current practice. So they should, if they actually, it depends on what the informational basis is. Okay, so this is looking at a situation where the government is a lot more complicated, and these mechanisms, these auction type mechanisms, might also be designed to kind of extract information that the government doesn't have to start with. So the government might actually not have a good idea of the value of broadband to different potential bidders, and the auction might really be a kind of price discovery process for the government. Okay, so the government might not be able to competently bargain with individual bidders in some of these applications. But if it could, then this theory suggests that you could do very well by sequentially picking off bidders. So if you had some restriction in the number of potential bidders you could deal with, then this suggests you shouldn't be kind of trying to deal with them all simultaneously. You should, make it clear that there is a bidder out there who has a high value, and you're going to have to compete with that bidder for, and to do that successively.
Thank you. Let's wind up the session. Thank you again, Dilip, for a wonderful talk.
Thank you.